Steven Seagal is the worst host in SNL history. And that's not just my opinion. That is the opinion of literally everybody who worked on the show at the time that he was a host. And there's not even a debate about it among people who worked on the show at the time. Al Franken says he was easily one of the biggest idiots and worst hosts he's ever seen. And Bob Odenkirk agrees.
And Seagal's an idiot in addition to everything else, and has no sense of humor.
He kept saying, "I've never seen your show. I don't know what you do here." Like, really? You've never seen Saturday Night Live?
Over the 50 years of SNL, there have been a ton of bad hosts. Paris Hilton was one, Roseanne was considered pretty bad, and even convicted felon Donald Trump hosted twice. But does having a bad host mean having a bad episode? Yeah, actually it does. And how bad is Steven Seagal's episode? Well, let's go through it sketch by sketch and we can all cringe together. Seagal hosted the 18th episode of the 16th season of Saturday Night Live with musical guest Michael Bolton. The show aired on April 20th, 1991, and according to Al Franken, has never been shown in broadcast reruns. There is a shortened version of the episode available on Peacock, but as far as I can tell, the full episode, including Michael Bolton's musical performances, are not available for streaming anywhere. I was, however, able to track down a copy of the entire episode, and thank you to the person who recorded this from TV back in 1991, saved your VHS tape, and then eventually uploaded it to the internet. We all owe you one. The cold open was Pumping Up with Hans and Franz, a popular recurring sketch where the two titular characters were played by Dana Carvey and Kevin Nealon. SNL hasn't been doing as many recurring characters since about the late 90s or early 2000s, but they have been going back to that well more recently with characters like Lisa from Temecula and Domingo. Essentially, the thesis of this sketch is that Steven Seagal is tough and beats people up, and you'll see that a lot more as this episode goes on. There are a couple of funny lines, none of which are delivered by Seagal, and when he's on screen, the energy level of the sketch just drops. His pace is so slow, and it's almost like the other actors are just waiting for him to read his lines so they can hurry up and end the sketch. Overall, it's not a very funny sketch as far as a Hans and Franz goes, but the audience did seem to be pretty excited when Seagal made his appearance, so maybe that bodes well. This season of SNL had some of the most legendary performers in the show's history, and many would go on to massive stardom. Phil Hartman, Mike Myers, Dana Carvey, Adam Sandler, and Chris Rock are all featured prominently in this episode, but it's interesting to see how having a host as bad as Steven Seagal can drag the episode down, even given this immensely talented cast. The musical guest was Michael Bolton, and I will talk more about him later on in the video and explain how his performance and appearances actually helped elevate the show. When Steven Seagal comes out to deliver his monologue, the crowd seems pretty hot for him. They gave him a pretty good round of applause, but as soon as he opens his mouth, everything goes off the rails. He talks a little bit about the kind of movies that he's been in, and he's got all these weird, awkward pauses for applause. Like, he lists a couple of movies that he's in, and he's like kind of just like waiting for the audience to applaud for him, and they kind of catch on after about a second, but there's still a real awkward silence after he's done listing what movies he's been in recently. So he goes on and on and on about how his characters are more than just fighting tough guys who are martial artists. He talks about how he wants to explore his character's relationship with God. And it's like, I've seen Steven Seagal movies. That is not any of the subtext at all. It's mostly just this guy goes around beating people up. So I don't know what the hell he was talking about. But anyway, he decides he's going to finish his monologue by singing a song. So he grabs a guitar from off stage and he starts playing Carl Douglas's Kung Fu Fighting, but he's not really singing it. He just kind of talks over the song, and it's not funny. Like, he doesn't change the lyrics or anything. He just sings it or says it straight up over the music. He is actually playing the guitar, which is kind of interesting. And poor Tim Meadows and Chris Rock just have to stand there in the background and sing back up to this absolute travesty. Like, it's not funny. It's a terrible way to start the show. And it really is just a sign of things to come as to how bad this episode does actually get. So the way the show worked back in the 90s is that after the monologue, they would usually have a commercial parody. And this particular commercial parody is one of the most out there ones that I've ever seen. The whole premise is it's about a funeral home that promises not to have sex with the dead bodies of your loved ones. Now, I love me some dark humor, and I love a good, like, absurdist bit of comedy, but this one is just, it's even a little too much. It's like there's no other jokes. It's just they're just going on and on about how they promise not to have sex with the bodies that they're responsible for at the funeral home. And I kind of get the feeling that they were never really sure about this commercial parody. Like, they filmed it and they were still kind of on the fence about it. And they were like, you know what, let's just throw it on a really shitty episode. And they were like, oh, Steven Seagal's on this week. let's run the we won't have sex with your relative's dead body funeral home commercial, and that'll be great. And again, not really a funny one. It's a bit edgy, and I do love edgy humor, but this one is just a little bit too out there for me. So I do think they picked the right episode to add it to. It doesn't help or enhance the episode at all, but it does fit in. Okay, the first sketch is called Tanelli, and it's a sketch where Steven Seagal plays a tough guy who beats everybody up. And it goes without saying that Steven Seagal sucks in this sketch, but I do have to give it to the other actors in this one, including Rob Schneider, who I normally don't like, because they're obviously doing their absolute best to carry the performance. Seagal can barely get through his lines, and he's obviously reading from the cards the whole time. Phil Hartman, Julia Sweeney, and especially Chris Farley are great, and they act the hell out of their parts, and kudos to them. I mean, they're total professionals. They're doing their best to make sure that the sketch doesn't completely sink. So in the second part of the sketch, Rob Schneider's recurring character, Rich the Copy Guy, appears. Rich the Copy Guy was another very popular recurring character on SNL at the time. He was really easy to impersonate, so everyone at school on Monday morning would be doing the making copies voice, and we all thought it was hilarious at the time, but I think the point of it was that he was a really annoying character that everyone's got in their office, and that totally makes sense. But then, of course, Steven Seagal decides he's going to beat him up, so he beats him up a little bit and throws him out the window and dangles him out the window, and the punchline is that Steven Seagal is dangling Rob Schneider out the window. Now, there's probably a lot of people who would love to dangle Rob Schneider out a window right now, but back in 1991, it just wasn't funny. It comes across as Steven Seagal as this big tough guy picking on tiny little Rob Schneider while he's playing a beloved character that people thought was funny. So there's no punchline to this sketch. It's not actually funny. There's no comedy in it. It's just Steven Seagal going around beating people up. The next sketch is one that's called All-Star Celebrity Tribute. So the Persian Gulf War had just come to an end a few months before this, and I guess there must have been a bunch of like specials celebrating the end of the war and things, because the joke of this sketch was that each individual soldier coming home gets their own comedy special. Now, mercifully, Steven Seagal isn't in this sketch at all, which I think is really rare for an SNL host. Like, they very rarely do entire sketches where the host isn't in them in some way. And it's not like there was any dearth of characters that could have been played. He could have been anywhere on this sketch, but I think they purposefully decided to write him out. Like, they probably said, oh, you know, this is a celebrity impression sketch. You don't really do impressions, so we'll just do this one without you. But I just think they were trying to kill time and keep Seagal off screen as much as possible. So this sketch goes on for a while. This is an 8-minute long sketch, and I really do think because the length of this sketch, they were just trying to kill time with Steven Seagal off screen. And I'm sure the celebrity impressions were good. I'm not aware of any of the people that they were trying to impersonate, but it doesn't hold up all these decades later. It's still a blessing that Seagal, however, is not on screen. The Dark Side with Nat X was a sketch that starred Chris Rock, and I think they were trying to make this his kind of signature recurring character, and he does make appearances in subsequent episodes of SNL, and I really liked the character, and I liked the sketch, and for my money, this is the best sketch of the evening. Chris Rock plays Nat X, who is a militant black activist whose show focuses on pointing out the injustices inflicted on him and his community by the man. Now, I always thought these sketches were funny, and for my money, this is easily the best sketch of the whole episode. Seagal is in it, but only for a very short time at the end, playing Andrew Dice Clay, another very dated celebrity reference, at the very end of this sketch. The absolute highlight, though, is when Chris Farley comes out dressed as a clown and reads a viewer letter, and he is so goddamn funny. So much so that you can actually see Chris Rock, whose character is supposed to be serious and angry, just totally crack up at Farley's hilarious performance. Now, Seagal does a marginally passable impression of Andrew Dice Clay, who was kind of a shock comedian back in the early 90s, but his line delivery and pacing is so slow and so bad, it just once again sucks the whole energy out of the sketch. Like, it grinds to a halt when he's on screen, and it goes almost in reverse when he starts delivering his lines. He fumbles his lines all over the place, and it completely takes away from what would normally be an otherwise pretty good sketch. Deep Thoughts with Jack Handy would pop up every once in a while over the next few seasons, and again, there's no Steven Seagal in this, so it is a bit of a respite, but this sketch is only about 20 seconds long, so the relief doesn't last for very long. I always found Deep Thoughts to be kind of hit or miss, and this one was definitely a miss. Sometimes I just didn't get them.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Bolton.
Good God, Seagal couldn't even say "Ladies and Gentlemen, Michael Bolton" without being weird. All right, look, so everyone's mom had a Michael Bolton CD in their minivan in the early 90s, and there's no question that he was an incredibly popular musical artist at the time. His first performance is the song "Love is a Wonderful Thing" from his Time, Love, and Tenderness album, which would eventually go on to sell 16 million copies worldwide. So yeah, Michael Bolton was a huge deal back in 1991. After the first musical performance, that means it's time for Weekend Update. So in 1991, Weekend Update was hosted by Dennis Miller. Now, he's not my favorite Weekend Update anchor. I always thought his delivery was very smug and a little bit too holier than thou, but that's kind of typifies Dennis Miller as a comedian anyway. So I guess it's perfectly on brand for him. Now, like all Weekend Updates, it's very topical, so while I was pretty news aware back in 1991, I didn't really get a lot of the jokes. There were a lot of bad jokes about Ted Kennedy and a sex scandal, which 100% would not fly today, but again, it was a different time back in the 90s. Either that or they just weren't funny, because I really don't like Dennis Miller as an update anchor. He was replaced eventually by Kevin Nealon, and I personally think that Kevin Nealon was one of the all-time great Weekend Update anchors, miles better than Dennis Miller. There are two guests on Update. The first is Nealon playing his Mr. Subliminal character. He was a recurring character on Update, and he even continued to play that character when he was anchoring Update. So a long-time popular character there, Mr. Subliminal. Not a bad bit that he did about Nancy Reagan's book. And the second character was Adam Sandler, just, I think, doing Adam Sandler doing like stand-up. That was commonplace for a lot of the new actors on SNL. They would come on and do a bit of stand-up. You see it with Chris Rock, you see it with Adam Sandler, you see it nowadays too. But his bit, I don't know, it didn't really strike a chord with me. I guess it's funny if you like Adam Sandler style stand-up. I much prefer Adam Sandler in movies over his stand-up act, but in later seasons of Weekend Update, when he starts doing his songs, that's when he really shines. At this point in the episode, there have been 6 sketches and Update, and Seagal has only been in 3 of them. Thankfully, he also skips this sketch as well, Musicians for Free-Range Chickens. The sketch is about a charity We Are the World type song about free-range chickens. Michael Bolton shows his comedic chops in this song, and he really just gives it his all. Now, this sketch exemplifies why I think Seagal is singled out as SNL's worst ever host, and that is because he takes himself way too seriously. So here we have Michael Bolton singing his heart out about free-range chickens, and it works. It works because Bolton is parodying himself. He's satirizing himself, and he's not taking himself too seriously. He's using his immense vocal talents in a very comedic way, and his ability to self-satire is really underlined many years later when he and The Lonely Island collaborate on Captain Jack Sparrow, which is one of my personal favorite Lonely Island songs. Now, this was another sketch that they dragged out with more celebrity impressions and what I assume was a further attempt to keep Seagal off screen. Sandler's Axl Rose is great, and David Spade is dressed as Tom Petty, but I don't think he actually sings at all. He just kind of stands next to Dana Carvey playing Bob Dylan, making a Tom Petty face, I guess. It's not the greatest parody song that SNL has ever done, but it's certainly not the worst either. And the way Michael Bolton wholeheartedly invests in it and really kind of gives it his all, elevates it above a lot of the other sketches in this show. And for my money, this is probably the runner-up for best sketch of the episode. Okay, whatever. Another time killer with Jack Handey, sans Steven Seagal, so I'm all for it. This one was a little bit funnier than the first one, but whatever. It's Jack Handey. In this next sketch, Steven Seagal branches out a little and plays, can you guess, a tough guy who likes to beat people up. Chris Farley plays a guy who arrives to pick up Seagal's daughter for a date, and Steven Seagal goes on to tell the guy that he used to be a government assassin. Now, of all the sketches Seagal was in this episode, this one could have worked if he'd been able to deliver his lines with any pacing or comedic timing at all. But because he's mumbling and stumbling through most of his lines, it again slows everything down and sucks the energy out of the sketch at all. It could have worked. We could have had one decent sketch out of Seagal, but because he didn't bother to either learn his lines or forgot them or was too adamant about reading them off the cue cards, he just ruins the whole flow of the sketch, and it really just ties an anchor around what could have been a potentially decent sketch. Brian Steele, Greenpeace photographer. This one is infamous. Al Franken actually makes reference to this on some of the podcasts where he discusses Steven Seagal as a terrible host. This one, he says, was all of Seagal's idea. And you'll notice that Kevin Nealon is in it and Phil Hartman is in it, but there's other actors on there who are not part of the cast. Now, according to Al Franken, these are professional stunt people that SNL hired so that Steven Seagal could play a tough guy and beat them all up. I'm not even going to bother to set up the premise of the sketch. Seagal plays a guy who's spying on Exxon executives and then just goes in and beats them all up because they're polluting the environment, I guess.
This is what happens when you pollute the planet.
And we get to see Mike Myers in Yellowface, so that's great. This is another one of those sketches that feels like it goes on forever and ever, and it has no punchline. Except for Steven Seagal beats up a bunch of guys. There's no comedy in it. It's not funny. And this is like an action movie scene, but they have to do it live on a stage, so that makes it even that much more awkward. Now, because a couple of the actors are professional stuntmen, Seagal can kind of throw them around willy-nilly as much as he'd like, but look how hard he tosses poor Phil Hartman through the wall towards the end of the sketch. It actually doesn't look like he's acting at all. He's not doing stage combat. He's kind of using a martial arts technique and just tossing this guy right through the wall without any care or concern about how he's going to land. Like, I don't know if Steven Seagal knows about acting, but like, Phil Hartman's going to play along. Like, regardless of how hard you throw him in real life, he's probably going to go through that wall. So you don't have to push him down like you're actually defending yourself against an attacker. It's really, I mean, emblematic of how bad and how crappy Steven Seagal is, not just as an actor, but apparently as a person as well, and just giving no thought to other people around him, just doing his best to make himself look tough. To make this video, I had to watch this episode through 4 times, and by this point in the show, each time I watched it, I was just so done with Steven Seagal, and I couldn't wait for the goodnights. Now, right from the get-go, you can see that this is not going to be a typical goodnight segment where everyone walks around and congratulates each other on having a great show and shares hugs and laughs. First of all, look at poor Michael Bolton standing next to Seagal here. He looks like he wants absolutely nothing to do with Steven Seagal. And so when Steven Seagal says thanks to everybody and he takes a big bow, the band kicks in and Steven Seagal shakes a few hands and then just walks to the back of the stage and turns his back on the audience and the cast and just pretends like he's listening to the band jam it out. And everyone's just kind of standing around awkwardly, not sure what to do. It looks like the episode was hosted by Chris Rock because he's standing there front and center. I'm sure, as this was his first season on SNL, I'm sure that he loves that exposure, but also it's like that's where the host is supposed to be. But look at the faces of dejection on some of the cast. Like, yeah, there's a few smiles, but you can tell that none of them really enjoyed putting this show together or enjoyed being in it, even though they did really good work aside from having to bounce themselves off Steven Seagal. For the most part, you can tell everyone looks disappointed and miserable, but also relieved that this show is finally over. The silliness is such a critical part of being a successful SNL host. And when you think of some of the all-time great SNL hosts like Justin Timberlake or John Mulaney or Adam Driver and Tom Hanks or Christopher Walken, Ryan Gosling, they all have something in common that they aren't afraid to be silly and absolutely do not take themselves too seriously. This is something Steven Seagal was obviously incapable of doing. Al Franken said that Steven Seagal had no sense of humor, and that absolutely shows, not just in the fact that he was the worst host ever, but the fact that being the worst host ever leaves you with one of the worst episodes ever. So through the episode, you get the impression that the cast was just doing their best to make up for his lack of energy and excitement, and it shows how talented and professional this cast actually was. They knew the show was going to be bad, but they didn't let it affect their performances at all. I feel like some of the sketches had potential, like the date intimidation sketch. With a different actor playing the dad, it could have been way, way better. I'm not saying it would have been an all-time great or anything, but it wouldn't stand out for its shittiness like it does because of Seagal. Well, so there it is. There is the episode of SNL hosted by the worst host in SNL history. Does this make it one of the worst episodes of SNL? I think so. From start to finish, it was pretty bad. There are a couple of highlights. Michael Bolton's musical performance was great. I did like the Nat X sketch and the chicken sketch. But other than that, it was basically just, here's Steven Seagal going around beating people up. That's not comedy. That's not funny. There was nothing good about any of those sketches. So who do you think was another one of the worst SNL hosts of all time? Leave those answers in the comments, and maybe I will make a video about another terrible SNL host. Well, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.